how Simi, which is the predecessor to the Indian Mujahideen, this is what the book says. It was in the run-up to the Babri demolition that Simi's political rhetoric hardened further and matched the aggressive Hindu stance in the heartland of India. Rejecting suggestions of restraint and advocacy of dialogue between the two communities, Simi declared that the time had come for Muslims to wage jihad against the Indian state or the Hindus, as Islam was under threat in the country. With Hindu fundamentalists putting pressure on India's secular fabric, Simi played in the fears of the minority community to gain legitimacy as representatives of Muslims, rather than a sundry radical Muslim fringe group. In February 1991, Simi organized Babri Masjid Day, holding demonstrations against the efforts of Hindu militants to destroy the disputed mosque at Ayodhya, as it was seen countering the aggressive Hindu stance with its own rabid rhetoric. Simi's popularity grew within the minority-dominated pockets in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh, as the organization rejected secular parties and made a bid to establish its own political identity. It goes on. And then in another very interesting passage, it says how Kapadia, Abdul Bashar, and then Abdul Subhan, names known, well-known names to the security establishment. This is how the radicalization takes place. Kapadia said that each session would start with a recitation of the Holy Quran verses by Abdul Bashar and then Abdul Subhan, would remind the audience about the war sanctioned by the Prophet to save Islam in this world. The discussion was then amplified and extrapolated to the current situation of Muslims in the world. Feeding on the insecurity of the audience, Abdul Subhan and Bashar made them believe that Muslims everywhere were being tortured and murdered. They would talk of Palestine and the exploitation of innocent Iraqi Muslims by US soldiers. Then the speakers would focus on India. They would keep reminding us about the demolition of the Babri Masjid and the 2002 Gujarat riots. They would show us photographs of dead bodies of Muslim women and children, either burnt or brutally killed in communal violence. From among us, they selected enthusiastic youth who were both physically and emotionally strong and also loyal to the core ideology. They relentlessly kept convincing us that someone from the community should take revenge and kill people of a particular community. I was one of the few selected by Abdus, and he kept me with him for 3 months, Kapadia admitted, visiting Maharashtra, Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh during that time in his interview to the Indian Express. So there are, quote-unquote, reasons, quote-unquote, causes, quote-unquote, provocation for the rise of Simi and then the Indian Mujahideen. There's another enemy within. This book doesn't deal with it. It alludes to it. The right-wing extremist terrorist groups. That also deserves research and study. They are radicalizing right-wing youth in the same manner that Simi and Indian Mujahideen radicalized the youth that are referred to in this book. So actually we do not have one enemy within today, we have 2 enemies within. And I hope there will not be a 3rd or a 4th or a 5th. While the security establishment must treat it as a security issue, must build capacity, must improve its intelligence gathering capabilities, and must deal with these groups fearlessly and sternly. The rest of us what is now popularly called civil society, must indeed deal with the causes and the provocations that give rise to these enemies within. We cannot ignore that part. Because if these causes, if these provocations, if these reasons remain, and they continue to motivate and inspire one enemy within or the other enemy within, and every year younger men join the ranks of these enemies, whatever capacity we build in the security establishment will be inadequate to deal with the rising ranks of enemies, with the growing ranks of enemies. So this is the appeal that I would make, that civil society owes an obligation to address the reasons, good or bad, justified or misguided reasons, which gives rise to these young men being radicalized. There are examples here of some young women too. In fact, the 5 Kerala boys who were taken to Kashmir in order to take them into Pakistan and who were killed on the border were escorted and guided by a female father. That is as important as dealing with the enemy within by the security establishment. As far as the security establishment is concerned, I'm glad that Shishir acknowledged that we no longer jump to conclusions. Both in Pune and Mumbai, I insisted that no conclusion should be drawn until the investigations took us to the most probable suspect. I mean, no one can be sure whether a person is guilty or not until he's punished in a court of law. All you can say is he's the most probable suspect in the case. Despite my caution, we made a mistake in Pune. We arrested the wrong brother. But there is some explanation for that. The 2 brothers looked so alike, and in a video, it was very difficult to make one from the other. Both were brothers, both looked alike, so one was mistaken for the other. So I think it's an excusable mistake, but we cannot make inexcusable mistakes, which is why in Mumbai we are proceeding with great caution. In my view, and this point I will make tomorrow, there have been only 2 major terrorist attacks since 26/11. One was in Pune on 13th of February 2010, the other was in Mumbai on 13th of July 2010. I'm sure people will hotly dispute my statement. What about Varanasi? What about Jammu Masjid? Now, while Shishir comes to certain conclusions and even points to the guy who planted the bomb, I'm afraid he's making the mistake that he cautioned us against. While there are indeed similarities in the incident in Varanasi and Jammu Masjid with Pune and Mumbai, there are also significant differences. And the author notes the differences, but yet he makes bold to draw some conclusions. A couple of other incidents that have happened, there is no evidence at the moment that there were terrorist attacks. See, we would have to define a terrorist attack before we enter this debate. What happened in Imphal 3 days ago was also a terrorist attack, where we believe a person by name Anthony, town commander of one of the militant organizations, was carrying a bomb, and the bomb exploded a few minutes before it was supposed to explode, and he was killed along with 4 other bystanders. Now that is terrorist in the strict sense of the term, but in the discussion that we are having, we don't count that as terrorist, we count that as part of the insurgency in the Northeast. Similarly, in central India, we don't count the Maoist security forces clashes as terrorist. We call them left-wing extremist violence. So since we are discussing terrorist in the context of violence perpetrated by organizations like the Indian Mujahideen or similar organizations, I think we should be careful in dealing with each incident before we brand it as a terrorist incident. That is why I say there have been 2 major terrorist attacks, and they are undoubtedly terrorist attacks. Undoubtedly terrorist attacks, Pune and Mumbai. Now we must build capacity. We must improve intelligence. We must build capacity at the state level. The center has an important role to play, but pounding the streets, that's what they say, what Shishir said as enough feet on the ground. That is a function of the state government. And unless state governments wake up to the gravity of the situation, it will be very difficult to say that we can preempt or prevent every terror attack. Now I know there are a number of people who say that in the last 2.5 years we have not succeeded in preempting an attack. That's completely wrong. Shishir's book itself gives a number of examples. I compliment him for getting that, I thought, closely guarded secrets. I didn't give it to him. We have been successful, our agencies have been successful.